The late afternoon sun cut through the high, rectangular windows of the old community center, casting long, dusty beams of light across the scuffed tile floor. Arthur Vance stepped carefully over a cable that had been taped down rather haphazardly, his expensive Italian shoes making a sharp clicking sound that seemed too loud for the quiet building. He was a man who was used to control, used to things being exactly as he envisioned them the moment he walked into a room. Today, however, things were not falling into place. Arthur ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and sighed, a sound of heavy frustration. He stopped in the middle of the vast open hall and placed his hands on his hips, looking around like a king inspecting a crumbling kingdom. To his left, a young woman in a headset was frantically scribbling on a clipboard, and to his right, a cameraman was quietly wiping a lens with a cloth. They could all feel the tension radiating off their director. This was supposed to be a simple scout for his new project, a low-budget film that he claimed would be his return to humanity, but so far, the humanity was proving to be a bit too rustic for his taste. "This is the space?" Arthur asked, his voice echoing slightly. He didn't turn to look at his assistant, a young man named David who was trailing nervously behind him. "This is where we are supposed to film the emotional climax, the breakthrough scene." David swallowed hard and nodded, even though Arthur wasn't looking at him. "Yes, sir. The light is supposed to be incredible around sunset, and the acoustics are surprisingly good for dialogue. It fits the script's requirement for a fading but noble setting." Arthur grunted. He walked further into the room, his eyes scanning every corner, every crack in the plaster, every peeling strip of paint. He was looking for flaws, and he was finding them in abundance. But his main focus was on the stage area at the far end of the hall. The script called for a grand piano. It specifically detailed a shiny, black concert grand that would reflect the character's inner turmoil. Arthur had pictured it in his mind perfectly, a sleek beast of an instrument that looked expensive and sounded expensive. He stopped dead in his tracks when he reached the stage. There was no sleek black beast. There was no shine. There was no expensive reflection. Instead, huddled in the center of the wooden stage planks, was an upright piano that looked like it had been abandoned in a forest for 50 years. It was a mess of chipped darkwood and scratches. One of the legs was propped up by a thick, old telephone book to stop it from wobbling. The top was lifted, revealing a felt that had faded from a deep red to a dusty pink. It looked tired. It looked pathetic. Arthur stared at it for a long 10 seconds. He waiting for the punchline. He waited for someone to say, "Don't worry, the real one is coming." But nobody said a word. The silence in the room grew heavy. "David," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "Yes, sir. Please tell me that this." He pointed a finger at the old instrument, his hand shaking slightly with disbelief. "Please tell me that this is a joke. Or perhaps a prop for a horror movie that was left behind by the previous tenants." David stepped forward, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Well, sir, the budget committee, they said renting a concert grand for 2 weeks wasn't feasible. They mentioned that this piano comes with the hall. It's included in the rental fee. It's a vintage model." Arthur turned to look at his assistant, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Vintage, David? That is not vintage. That is garbage. That is a fire hazard. You expect my lead actor to sit at that thing and pour his heart out? He's supposed to be a genius pianist who has lost his muse, not a janitor trying to fix a broken bench." The cameraman, who had been quietly listening, spoke up tentatively. "Actually, Mr. Vance, old uprights sometimes have a really nice, warm sound. It might fit the down on his luck vibe of the character. Arthur shot him a look that silenced him immediately. He turned back to the stage and marched up the 3 wooden steps. They creaked under his weight, which only annoyed him further. He walked right up to the piano and stood over it, glaring down as if it had personally insulted him. He could see the dust collecting in the corners of the keys. Some of the ivory key tops were chipped, revealing the dark wood underneath. It smelled like old varnish and neglect. He reached out and touched the side of the piano. It was sticky. Arthur snatched his hand back and wiped his palm on his trousers, his lip curling in disgust. "This is unacceptable," he announced to the room at large. "I cannot work under these conditions. I create art. I create beauty. This." He gestured wildly at the sad, leaning piece of furniture. "This is an eyesore. It ruins the entire visual palette of the scene." He looked around the hall, hoping someone would argue with him, hoping someone would give him a solution that didn't involve this wreck of a piano. But the crew just stood there, knowing that when Arthur got like this, there was no reasoning with him. He was a tornado of perfectionism, and anything in his path that didn't shine was going to get blown away. "Get it out of here," Arthur commanded, pointing toward the large double doors at the back of the hall. "Get it out of my sight. Right now." David hesitated. "But, sir, if we remove it, we have no instrument for the scene. We can't afford a replacement. Then we don't shoot the scene," Arthur yelled, his voice bouncing off the high ceiling. "We rewrite it? I don't care. I am not filming that thing. It looks like it belongs on a curb waiting for the trash truck." He let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure mockery. He laughed at the piano, shaking his head at the sheer absurdity of it being in his movie. "Look at it," he said, chuckling darkly. "It's leaning. It's missing pieces of wood. It's a joke. A bad joke." Arthur reached out and shoved the top of the piano hard. The instrument rocked slightly on its uneven leg, the telephone book sliding a fraction of an inch. It made a dull, thudding sound inside the cabinet, a hollow protest. "Listen to that," Arthur laughed again, turning to his crew with a sneer. "It sounds empty. It's hollow. Just like this location." He felt a surge of power, a sense that he was righting a wrong simply by demanding its removal. He was the director, after all. His vision was the only thing that mattered. If this old, battered piece of history didn't fit his vision, it had to go. He didn't care how long it had sat there or how many songs it had played in the past. To him, it was just an object that was currently ruining his afternoon. "I said get it out." Arthur barked at 2 stagehands who were standing near the equipment cases. "You too. Pick it up. Move it. Put it in the storage room. Put it in the dumpster. I don't care where it goes as long as I don't have to look at it." The 2 men looked at each other, then at the heavy piano, then back at the furious director. "It's heavy, boss," one of them mumbled. "And we don't have a dolly. Figure it out." Arthur snapped. He turned his back on the piano, dismissing it from his mind completely. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, intending to call the producers and give them a piece of his mind about the budget. He started walking away toward the exit, eager to get out of the stale air of the hall. "Just get it gone," he muttered over his shoulder, his footsteps clicking sharply against the tile floor as he stormed away. "And someone get me a coffee. This place is depressing." The room filled with the sound of shuffling feet and heavy sighs as the crew prepared to do the grunt work. The stagehands approached the piano with reluctance, their hands finding purchase on the rough edges of the frame. The piano sat silently, waiting for the inevitable, holding its breath like an old dog that knows it is being sent away. The sunlight moved across the wall, inching closer to the chipped keys, as if trying to offer one last touch of warmth before the darkness took over. Arthur stood by the door, his back turned, scrolling through his contacts with agitated thumbs. He didn't hear the soft creak of the piano bench as someone unexpected sat down. He didn't notice the change in the air. He was too busy being angry, too busy laughing at the imperfection of the world, to realize that he was about to be proven completely wrong. The two burly stage hands, Matt and Ray, grunted with effort as they tried to lift the heavy instrument. It didn't budge easily. The piano seemed anchored to the floor, not by bolts, but by its own sheer weight and stubbornness. Ray wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm and looked at Matt, shaking his head. The friction of the legs against the wooden stage was creating a screeching sound that made everyone wince. It was the sound of something resisting its fate. Arthur was still by the exit door, his phone pressed to his ear, but he hadn't started talking yet. He was watching the struggle with a look of annoyed impatience, tapping his foot against the floor. To him, this wasn't just heavy lifting, it was incompetence. If they couldn't move a simple piece of furniture, how were they going to handle a complex film shoot? He opened his mouth to shout a sarcastic comment about using a crowbar, but the words died in his throat before he could speak them. A small, frail figure had emerged from the shadows of the side hallway. It was an older woman who moved with the help of a metal cane, though she didn't lean on it heavily. She wore a simple, knitted gray cardigan over a floral dress, and her white hair was pulled back into a loose bun. She didn't look like she belonged on a movie set. In fact, she looked like she should have been sitting on a porch somewhere, knitting a scarf and watching the birds. But there was a fire in her eyes that belied her age. She walked toward the stage with surprising speed, the cane tapping a rhythmic beat against the tile floor. "Stop. Please, stop that right now." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a distinct authority that cut through the noise of the screeching piano legs and the murmuring crew. Matt and Ray froze immediately, their hands still gripping the edges of the piano frame. They looked at the woman, then at Arthur, unsure of whose command to follow. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Arthur lowered his phone slowly, turning to face the interruption. He stared at her with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "Excuse me," Arthur said, his voice cold and sharp. "Who are you and why are you interrupting my set?" The woman ignored him. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage with difficulty, her grip tightening on her cane. She didn't look at Arthur. She walked straight past the struggling men and placed a hand gently on the side of the piano, as if she were checking the forehead of a sick child. "You're hurting her," she said softly to the men. "You can't drag her like that. The casters are rusted. You'll break the legs." Arthur walked back toward the stage, his expensive shoes echoing again. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but this is a closed set. We are moving this junk out of here. It doesn't belong in my movie." The woman finally turned to look at him. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, maps of a long life, but her eyes were incredibly clear. They were a piercing blue, looking out through wire-rimmed glasses. She wasn't intimidated by his expensive suit or his harsh tone. "This isn't junk," she said calmly. "This is Bessie. And she stays." Arthur let out a short, incredulous laugh. He looked around at his crew, as if to say, "Can you believe this, Bessie?" he mocked. "You named this heap of firewood. Listen, I appreciate the sentimentality, really, I do. But I have a schedule to keep. I have actors arriving in an hour. I cannot have a dusty, broken piano sitting center stage. It ruins the shot. Now, please step aside so these men can do their job. I am the caretaker of this hall, the woman said, her voice firming up. I have taken care of this building for 30 years. This piano was donated to us before you were even born. It has sat on this stage for longer than I have worked here. It has survived floods, budget cuts, and bad renovations. It is not going to be dragged out by two men who don't know how to lift it. Arthur folded his arms, his frustration boiling over. He hated being contradicted, especially by someone he viewed as insignificant in his world. He felt the power dynamic shifting and he didn't like it. He needed to reassert control. Lady, he said, his tone dropping to a dangerous level. I don't care if it's been here since the Stone Age. It is ugly. It is out of tune. And it is leaving. If you don't move, I will have security remove you. The woman didn't flinch. She looked down at the piano keys, her expression softening. She saw the dust, the chips, and the missing ivory, but she didn't see the flaws that Arthur saw. She saw memories. She saw the church choirs that had practiced here, the children who had taken their first lessons, the Christmas concerts where the heat had broken but the music kept them warm. She knew this piano better than she knew most people. She turned back to Arthur. There was no anger in her face, just a quiet determination. You want a movie with soul, you want to capture real emotion, that is what you told the local newspaper, isn't it? You said you wanted to make something authentic. Arthur narrowed his eyes. Yes. And this piano is the opposite of authentic. It's a distraction. No, she said. It is the most authentic thing in this room. You have lights and cameras and scripts. But this piano just is. It has a voice. You are just too busy shouting to hear it. The crew was silent now. Even the cameraman had lowered his camera, watching the interaction unfold. It was better than television. Arthur, the man who controlled everything, was being stumped by a grandmother figure in a cardigan. Arthur scoffed, shaking his head. A voice, it's a machine. And a broken one at that. He gestured to the men. Pick it up. Move it. If she gets in the way, escort her out. The stagehands hesitated, looking very uncomfortable. They didn't want to manhandle an old lady, but they also didn't want to lose their jobs. The woman saw their hesitation. She let go of her cane. It stood upright on its own beside her and slowly sat down on the piano bench. It creaked under her weight, a familiar, welcoming sound. She placed her arthritic hands in her lap and looked at Arthur over her shoulder. You don't understand, she said softly. You think beauty is something you can buy or paint or polish. You think because the finish is worn, the music is gone. But the music isn't in the wood, young man. It's in the hands. Arthur rolled his eyes. Great. A philosophy lesson. Look, I don't have time for this. Give me 1 minute, she said. Excuse me. 1 minute, she repeated. Let me play. Just one note. If you still want to throw it out after you hear it, I won't stop you. I will help you push it out the door myself. But you have to listen first. Arthur looked at her. He looked at the dusty, pathetic instrument. He looked at his watch. He was already behind schedule. Logic told him to say no, to kick her out, and to get on with the day. But there was something in her eyes, a certainty, a challenge that stopped him. It was the same look he sometimes saw in actors right before they delivered a career-defining performance. It was the look of someone who knew they had the ace up their sleeve. He thought about the newspaper interview. He thought about the critics who called his recent work soulless and sterile. He needed this movie to work. He needed to prove he could do raw and real. Fine, Arthur snapped, checking his watch pointedly. 1 minute. 1 note. And then this thing goes. I don't care if you play like Mozart, if it looks like trash, it's trash. The woman smiled slightly, a tiny, knowing curve of her lips. She turned back to the piano. She didn't adjust the bench. She didn't crack her knuckles. She simply lifted her hands. They were shaking slightly, her knuckles swollen with age, but as they hovered over the keys, they became steady. Arthur stood at the bottom of the stage, his arms still crossed, his foot still tapping. He prepared himself to be unimpressed. He prepared to hear a tinny, thudding sound that would prove him right. He waited for the confirmation that he was the genius and she was just a sentimental old fool. The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen down the hall. The sunlight from the windows seemed to intensify, illuminating the dust motes dancing around the stage like tiny spectators. The woman took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the stale air of the hall, and then she brought her hands down. She didn't hit the keys. She didn't bang on them. She pressed into them with a firm, confident touch, sinking the weight of her entire being into the instrument. The sound that came out wasn't a note. It was a presence. It was a low, resonant C major chord that seemed to rise from the floorboards rather than the strings. It filled the entire hall instantly, washing over the cinderblock walls, vibrating in the metal light fixtures, and settling deep into Arthur's chest. It was warm and full, with a strange, singing quality that new pianos simply didn't have. It sounded like a human voice singing in a cathedral. Arthur's foot stopped tapping. His uncrossed his arms, just a little. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a look of blank confusion. The sound hung in the air like heavy smoke, refusing to fade away. It was a single, deep C major chord, but it didn't sound like the crisp, polished notes Arthur was used to hearing in recording studios. It had a rough edge to it, a sort of wooden groan that vibrated against the walls of the hall. It felt alive. Arthur stood frozen at the foot of the stage. His hands, which had been gesturing wildly just moments before, were now hanging limp at his sides. He blinked a few times, trying to process what his ears were hearing. In his world, sound was something to be controlled, polished, and auto-tuned until it was perfect. This was not perfect. The strings were slightly out of tune with each other, creating a wavering, shimmering effect that made the chords sound incredibly sad yet incredibly strong. It sounded like a person holding back tears. He looked at the old woman. She was pressing the keys down with a firmness that seemed impossible for someone so frail. Her eyes were closed. Her back was straight, transforming her from the shuffling caretaker into a statue of dignity. She wasn't playing to show off, she was playing to communicate. Arthur felt a strange tightening in his chest, a physical reaction to the resonance that he hadn't expected. He glanced quickly at his crew. The cameraman had lowered his camera completely, his mouth slightly open. The young woman with the clipboard had stopped writing and was leaning forward, her eyes wide. Even Matt and Ray, the stagehands who had been ready to haul the piano away, had let go of the instrument and were standing with their arms at their sides, listening. The room, which had been filled with the noise of ego and frustration just seconds ago, was now completely captive. The woman lifted her hands from the keys, but the sound seemed to linger in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Arthur. She didn't say, I told you so. She didn't smile smugly. She just sat there, her hands resting in her lap, waiting. Arthur swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. He cleared his throat, but the sound seemed pathetic compared to the note that had just filled the room. He wanted to regain his composure. He wanted to be the director again, the one who called the shots. But the authority had shifted. It wasn't with him anymore, it was sitting on that bench. Well, Arthur said, his voice sounding much weaker than he intended. He coughed to try and add some volume to it. That was adequate. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. It had been more than adequate. It had been haunting. The old woman didn't respond to his comment. She turned her face back toward the piano keys. Her fingers, which were twisted with arthritis, hovered over the ivories again. You asked for one note, she said softly, her voice barely reaching the back of the hall. But sometimes, one note isn't enough to finish a sentence. Before Arthur could object, she began to play again. This time, it wasn't a single chord. It was a melody. It started low in the bass, a slow, wandering line that sounded like someone walking down a lonely street. The piano responded with a surprising richness. The bass notes were deep and woody, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of Arthur's expensive shoes. It was a physical sensation, like a heartbeat. Arthur found himself taking a step closer to the stage. He didn't realize he was doing it. His feet were moving on their own, drawn in by the gravity of the music. The melody was simple. It wasn't a complex classical piece filled with fast runs and tricky finger work. It was a folk song, or maybe a hymn, something old and familiar that Arthur felt he should recognize but couldn't quite name. It sounded like a lullaby, but there was a sadness to it, a longing that tugged at the corners of his mind. As her right hand joined in, playing the higher notes, the imperfections of the piano became clear. Some of the higher keys were slightly tinny, ringing with a metallic buzz that would have driven a sound engineer crazy. But here, in the dusty hall, it sounded honest. It sounded like the instrument had been through a lot and was singing about its scars. Arthur crossed his arms, not in defiance this time, but in a self-protective hug. He suddenly felt very cold. The music was reminding him of things he tried hard to forget. He saw flashes of his childhood before the money, before the awards, before the ego. He saw a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. He saw his mother sitting at a window, looking out at the rain, humming a tune that sounded very much like this. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, shaking his head to banish the memory. He was Arthur Vance, a man of the future, a man of sleek lines and perfection. He didn't have time for ghosts. Yet, the music kept coming. The woman was playing with a feeling of rubato, stealing time from certain notes to give to others, making the music breathe. It wasn't rigid. It flowed like a river. Arthur found himself holding his own breath, waiting for the next phrase, wondering where she was taking him. He looked at the piano again. The sunlight was hitting the chipped wood, illuminating the scratches and the dents. For the first time, he didn't see a broken piece of furniture. He saw a survivor. He realized that the scratches were likely from movers bumping into door frames over decades. The water stains on the side were from a leaky roof that had since been fixed. This piano had history. It had lived a life. And now, under the woman's fingers, it was telling that life story. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. He remembered how he had laughed at it. He remembered his cruel words about it being firewood. He looked at the back of the woman's head, her white hair glowing in the light. She was defending this old machine not because it was valuable, but because it mattered. She was defending its dignity. And he, a man who claimed to be an artist, had tried to strip it of its dignity without even listening to it. The melody shifted. It moved into a minor key, becoming more complex, more urgent. The woman's left hand was marching up the scale, building tension. Arthur's heart began to beat faster. It felt like the soundtrack to a turning point in a movie, the moment where the hero realizes he has been wrong the whole time. He looked around the room again. His crew was mesmerized. The young assistant, David, had taken off his glasses and was wiping his eyes. Even the skeptical cameraman was nodding his head slightly, keeping time with the music. The atmosphere in the hall had completely changed. It was no longer a dusty, boring room. It was a sanctuary. The air felt thicker, charged with emotion. Arthur realized then that he had lost the argument. He hadn't just been outplayed, he had been outclassed. He had been using his voice to shout orders and demand perfection, while this woman was using her hands to speak the truth. The music began to slow down. The woman brought her hands back down to the lower register, playing the final few notes gently. She ended on a single, low note that resonated deeply, fading into silence gradually. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the silence that followed was heavy and sacred. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic outside and the quiet breathing of 30 people. Arthur stood at the edge of the stage, his mouth slightly open. He wanted to say something professional, something witty, or something authoritative. But his vocabulary seemed to have abandoned him. The words cut, action, and reset felt hollow and meaningless. The art he had been trying to manufacture with lights and cameras was sitting right in front of him, raw and unpolished. He looked at the old woman. She sat very still on the bench, her hands resting quietly. She didn't turn around. She didn't need his approval. She knew what she had done. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't the director in this room anymore. He was just another member of the audience, humbled and silenced by the power of a single, broken instrument. He slowly uncrossed his arms and let them hang by his sides, his palms open. For the first time in a long time, Arthur Vance was listening. The silence stretched out, long and fragile, like a thread pulled tight between the stage and the back of the hall. Nobody dared to move. The air in the room seemed to have changed weight, it felt heavier, charged with something that wasn't there before. The dusty sunlight continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the floating particles, but the atmosphere was no longer stale or boring, it was sacred. On the stage, the old woman sat with her back to the audience. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the energy leaving her small frame as the adrenaline of the performance faded. She kept her hands resting in her lap, her fingers intertwined, as if she were praying or simply keeping warm. She didn't turn around to look for approval. She didn't seek applause. She just sat there, listening to the ghost of the sound as it faded into the high ceiling of the hall. Arthur stood at the foot of the stage, frozen. The mental clipboard he carried in his head, filled with shot lists and lighting diagrams and complaints about the budget, had suddenly been wiped blank. He tried to grasp onto his anger, tried to find the irritation that had been so easy to summon just minutes ago, but it was gone. In its place was a strange, hollow feeling in his chest. He looked at the piano. Really looked at it? He saw the deep grooves in the wood near the keys, worn down by thousands of fingertips over decades. He saw the watermark on the side, shaped like a map of an unknown continent. He realized now that these weren't signs of damage. They were history. This instrument had been touched by people who loved music, people who played not for a paycheck or for fame, but because they needed to speak. The scratches were scars of a life lived fully. Arthur glanced over at his crew. David, his young assistant, was standing with his mouth slightly open, his forgotten clipboard dangling from his fingertips. The cameraman, a man who had spent 30 years looking at the world through a lens, had lowered his camera and was just staring, his eyes glistening slightly. Even the two stagehands, Matt and Ray, who just wanted to go home, were standing still with their arms at their sides, looking at the old woman with a mix of confusion and awe. It struck Arthur then how wrong he had been. He had spent weeks talking about emotional resonance and authenticity in production meetings. He had fired actors for not being real enough. He had screamed at set designers for making props look too fake. And yet, here he was, trying to throw away the most real thing in the room because it didn't fit his polished, superficial idea of what art should look like. He had been so focused on the visual surface that he had forgotten that movies were supposed to make people feel something. The memory of his mother pushed its way to the front of his mind again, uninvited and persistent. He saw her standing in their tiny kitchen, scrubbing dishes by hand, humming a melody that sounded exactly like the one the woman had just played. He remembered how tired she always looked, how her hands were rough and red from cleaning, but how her face would soften when she heard music. He realized suddenly that he hadn't thought about that melody in 20 years. He had buried it under layers of soundtracks and orchestral scores, thinking he had moved past it. But hearing the piano unlocked the door, he felt a burning sensation behind his eyes. He blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. Directors didn't cry on set. Directors were the captains of the ship. But he felt a crack forming in his armor, a fissure running right through the middle of his ego. The old woman shifted on the bench. The sound of the creaking wood seemed incredibly loud in the quiet room. She reached for her cane, which was leaning against the side of the piano, and gripped it tightly. She looked tired. The performance had taken everything out of her. She started to push herself up to stand. Arthur realized that the moment was breaking. The spell was about to end. If she walked away now, he wasn't sure he would be able to hold onto this feeling. He knew he had to do something, but his body felt heavy. He was used to sitting in a director's chair, comfortable and separated from the action. Standing up felt like a monumental effort. As the woman steadied herself and turned to slowly step down from the stage, a wave of panic washed over Arthur. He couldn't let her just leave. He couldn't let this be just another weird incident on a chaotic shoot. He needed to acknowledge what had just happened. He needed to show respect. His legs moved on their own. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a physical reaction to the gravity of the moment. He took a step forward. Then another. The clicking of his dress shoes on the tile floor was the only sound in the hall. The woman paused at the top of the steps, looking down at him. She expected him to yell. She expected him to tell them to get back to work. She was bracing herself for the dismissal. But Arthur didn't speak. He walked past the lighting stands, past the cables, until he was standing right at the edge of the stage. He looked up at her, his face stripped of the sarcastic smirk he usually wore. He looked tired, too. He looked like a man who had been fighting a war for years and suddenly realized he didn't want to fight anymore. He looked past the woman, at the piano. The instrument sat there, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. It wasn't a piece of junk anymore. It was a character. It was the protagonist of his movie. He could see the shot in his mind immediately, the camera low, looking up at the keys, the dust dancing in the light, the scratches visible in high definition. It wouldn't need filters. It wouldn't need touch UPS. It was perfect because it was broken. Arthur took a deep breath. The air smelled of old wood and dust, but it also smelled like possibility. He felt a profound sense of shame for his earlier behavior, but mixed with that shame was a surge of excitement. He had found his anchor. He had found the soul of his film in the last place he thought to look. The woman gripped her cane tighter, waiting for the verdict. The crew held their collective breath. David stopped breathing entirely. Arthur straightened his back. He wasn't just a rich man in a suit anymore, he was a witness to something beautiful, and he knew that the only appropriate response to beauty is respect. Slowly, with a deliberate motion that felt like it was happening in slow motion, Arthur bent his knees. He lowered his head. It wasn't about to a queen or a general, it was about to the music. It was an apology to the history he had almost discarded. He stayed there for a long second, the silence pressing against his ears. Then, he stood up straight. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't check his watch. He looked directly into the eyes of the old woman. "Don't go," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that silenced the city traffic outside. "Please. Don't move it." The old woman froze, her hand tightening around the rubber grip of her cane. She looked down at Arthur, her blue eyes searching his face for any sign of a trick. She had seen his type before, powerful people who acted nice until they got what they wanted, only to throw you away the moment the utility was gone. She expected him to laugh again, to say it was all a joke, or to demand she move so they could set up the lights. But Arthur didn't laugh. His expression was open, almost defenseless. The arrogant mask he had worn when he walked in had completely shattered. He looked like a man who had just been washed up on a shore after a storm, tired and grateful to be alive. He took a small step back, giving her space, as if he realized that his physical presence had been a threat just moments ago. "I mean it," Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some composure, but the humility remained. "I was wrong. It's perfect. Please. Stay." The woman studied him for a long moment. The silence in the hall was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the silence of a truce. Finally, her shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. She let out a small breath and nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Very well," she said softly. "But only if you promise to take care of her. She doesn't like loud noises." Arthur actually smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes for the first time that day. "I promise," he said. "We will be quiet. We will be respectful." He turned around to face his crew, and the change in the room was instantaneous. The confusion vanished, replaced by a burst of frantic but happy energy. David, the assistant, dropped his clipboard and rushed forward, pulling a tape measure from his pocket. "Okay, everyone, listen up," David shouted, though there was a tremor of excitement in his voice. "New plan. We are keeping the piano. I need lights set up for a vintage feel, warm, soft gels. No shiny reflectors. We want to accentuate the dust, not hide it." Matt and Ray, the two stage hands, grinned at each other. They carefully lowered the piano legs back to the floor, relieved they didn't have to carry the heavy beast out to the parking lot. They began to clear the other clutter off the stage, treating the piano like a king on a throne, moving gently around it so they wouldn't bump into it. Arthur stood back and watched them work. Usually, he would be barking orders, micromanaging every angle, every shadow. Today, he felt strangely calm. He walked over to the director's chair that had been set up for him near the camera. He looked at the plush leather seat, then at the dusty wooden floor. He left the chair empty. Instead, he walked up the side steps of the stage and stood in the wings, off to the side. He wanted to watch the scene unfold from the shadows, just like the old woman had done. The lead actor, a handsome young man named Julian who was known for his ego, strutted onto the set. He looked at the script in his hand, then looked at the old piano. He frowned. "Hey," Julian called out, turning to Arthur. "What's this? I thought we were getting a Steinway. This thing looks like it hasn't been tuned since the 50s. How am I supposed to play a concert pianist on this?" The room went quiet again. The crew paused, fearing Arthur's famous temper would return. Arthur walked over to Julian. He didn't yell. He didn't get angry. He put a hand on the young actor's shoulder and leaned in close. "Julian," he said quietly. "You aren't playing a concert pianist anymore. The script changed. You're playing a man who has lost everything. This piano is the only friend he has left. It's not about the technique. It's about the feeling. Just touch the keys. Let the instrument do the work." Julian looked confused, but he saw the seriousness in Arthur's eyes. He nodded slowly. "Okay. I can try." "Good," Arthur said. He clapped his hands together, but the sound was soft, not sharp. "Places, everyone. Let's shoot." The cameraman got into position. The sound boom hovered overhead like a silent bird. The old woman remained on the stage, sitting in a folding chair in the corner, watching. She wasn't in the shot, but her presence was felt by everyone. "Action," Arthur whispered. Julian sat down at the bench. He was used to acting with his face, with big gestures. But as he placed his hands on the chipped keys, he seemed to understand. He played a simple melody. It wasn't perfect, there were mistakes, but the sound that came out of that old piano was magical. The wood seemed to sigh, the strings vibrating with a warmth that wrapped around the room. On the monitor, the image looked stunning. The dust motes dancing in the light, the scratches on the wood, the raw emotion on the actor's face, it was real. It was the most honest thing Arthur had filmed in 10 years. Arthur watched the monitor, his throat tight. He saw his mother's face in the shadow of the actor's profile. He saw his own childhood home. He realized that he had been trying to run away from his past, trying to cover it up with gloss and glamour, but beauty was found in the struggle, in the survival, in the things that are worn down but still standing. The scene ended. The room held the final note until it faded away completely. "Cut," Arthur said. His voice was gentle. "Print. That was beautiful." The crew erupted in quiet cheers. Julian looked up, surprised, a genuine smile breaking across his face. He looked at the piano with new respect, patting the side of it gently. Arthur walked onto the stage. He ignored the actor, ignoring the camera. He walked straight to the corner where the old woman was sitting. She was looking down at her hands, a faint smile playing on her lips. Arthur stopped in front of her. He towered over her, but he felt small. "Thank you," he said. He meant it more than he had meant anything in a long time. "You saved this movie. You saved me from making a terrible mistake." The woman looked up, her eyes twinkling behind her glasses. "I didn't save anything," "Mr. Vance," she said kindly. "I just played the piano. You did the listening. That is the hard part." She reached out and patted his hand. Her skin was paper thin and soft, but her grip was firm. "It's good to be appreciated," she added. "Even old things like me and Bessie have a few songs left in us, I suppose." Arthur looked at her, then at the piano, then back at the crew who was working seamlessly together. The mood lifted, the heavy tension gone. He felt a sense of peace settle over him. The sun was finally setting outside, casting a deep orange glow through the windows, turning the dusty hall into a cathedral of light. "No," Arthur said, shaking his head slowly. "Not just old things. Important things." He straightened up and turned to the room. "All right, everyone," he announced, his voice strong and clear. "Pack it up for the day. We got what we needed. And someone, make sure this piano is covered properly before we leave. No dust sheets. Use the silk covers from the equipment truck. Treat it like a star." As the crew began to pack up, laughing and chatting about the shot, Arthur Vance stood on the stage one last time. He placed his hand on the top of the old piano, feeling the vibrations that still lingered in the wood. He laughed, but it wasn't the mocking laugh from before. It was a quiet, happy sound. He laughed at himself for being so foolish, for thinking that beauty could be manufactured. He grabbed his jacket and walked out of the hall, leaving the lights on for the piano, stepping out into the cool evening air. He didn't check his phone. He didn't look at his watch. He just walked, feeling lighter than he had in years, ready to finally listen to the world around him.